In the 1790s, the United States government faced difficulties that proved to have tremendous staying power. To the west, conflicts were erupting between Native Americans and encroaching settlers. To the east, fighting among European powers threatened U.S. interests. And internally, budding political parties were competing to shape the country's future. In tackling these issues, the young government set precedents which continue to affect America to the present day.
I believe scarcely anything short of a Chinese wall or line of troops will restrain land jobbers and the encroachment of settlers upon Indian territory.
The major focus of conflict between Native American people and the Americans in the 1790s is land in Ohio. And the reason for that is, from the Native American perspective, they believed they had won the war, and they did not want to give up the lands north of the Ohio River to the United States. In contrast, the United States government was heavily in debt when the war ended, and it needed access to those lands to pay off its war debts. So it begins to speculate in lands north of the Ohio. When that occurs, tribes like the Shawnees and the Miamis and the Delawares and the Wyandots fight back.
The United States then is in a position where it has to demonstrate its power, to defeat the Indians and take the land from them that way. And a number of American expeditions are sent into Indian country, into the Ohio Indian country, and they meet with very limited success. And in fact, in 1791, General Arthur St. Clair leads an army into Indian country, which is roundly defeated by the Indians led by Little Turtle.
The Native American defeat of St. Clair is one of the most spectacular defeats ever suffered by the United States in all of its military history. About half of the standing army of the United States suffers fatal casualties in that one battle, and part of the reason is that the Americans are so poorly prepared. The Indians completely surprise them. They surround their camp, open fire, and the American regular troops stand and fight very well, but the militia and the 6 months volunteers just break and run.
After the defeat, President George Washington placed Mad Anthony Wayne, a Revolutionary War hero, in charge of resolving the problem.
Wayne learns from St. Clair's mistakes. One of the things Wayne learns is he's not going to engage in a battle with Indians until he's good and ready. What Wayne does is build a fort, supply the fort, march a little bit further, build another fort, supply the fort, and gives no opportunity for Indian peoples really to engage him in the field. As he gets close enough to the main Indian towns at the Maumee, the Indians feel they have to engage him.
In August 1794, Wayne led 3,000 troops against the Shawnee in the Battle of Fallen Timbers. This time the tables were turned. In about 40 minutes, the Indian forces were vanquished. In 1795, the Treaty of Greenville was signed by the United States and the representatives of 12 Indian nations in the Ohio Valley.
Under the terms of that treaty, the Indian leaders cede to the United States essentially 2/3 of what is now Ohio. It's a recognition that the long struggle to preserve the Ohio River as a boundary to white settlement is now lost.
First of all, opens up almost all of Ohio, except for the northwest quadrant, to white settlement. Secondly, and this may be even more important, gives the United States government opportunity to establish military outposts within the center of Native American country, and that's obvious what's going to happen after that.
The Treaty of Greenville is an absolute disaster for Indian peoples, because what had happened with the collapse of the British alliance, the whole alliance of Indian peoples in that area fragments. By the time they come to Greenville, they're fighting with each other. So it shatters this alliance. It'll shatter it for about 10 years. There's incredible social breakdown. There's drinking. There's murders within villages. It is a very dark period for Indian peoples.
More of us have died since the Treaty of Greenville than we lost by the years of war before. And it is all owing to the introduction of liquor among us. This liquor that they introduce into our country is more to be feared than the gun and tomahawk.
The Treaty of Greenville was one of many treaties that the United States negotiated with Native Americans, but failed to keep.
I think Indian people took the treaties more seriously than the government, and they took it much more seriously than the people on the frontier. As far as whites were concerned, the treaties were something to be disregarded. I think that many people in Washington, many of the leaders attempted to take them seriously, but Native American people took them very seriously.
Nevertheless, the fact that the United States made agreements with Indian nations in the form of treaties turned out to be an important precedent. Under the Constitution, treaties are honored as the supreme law of the land.
And Indian peoples might not have gotten the best deal that you could conceive of, but very often they got the best deal that was possible given the circumstances in which they negotiated. They held out for what they could. And it's turned out in the 20th, 21st century that this is still the basis of Indian rights. It's the thing that sets Indian peoples apart from any other American citizens. They have treaty rights. Nobody else does.
Today, many Indian tribes are using old treaties to reassert their legal rights to the land.
The Oneidas were promised a certain amount of land in this area, and that was 264,000 acres. And in 1794, there was a treaty signed in Canandaigua, New York, with the U.S. government, and it was supposed to protect our land forever. Well, after that happened, it sounded good on paper, but the state of New York started to systematically steal our land, and there was nothing that the Indian people could do about it. Eventually, we got down to 32 acres.
The current land claims came about in the 1970s, and it went to federal court, and it was decided that New York State had no valid title to the area we're calling the Oneida Reservation. That was reaffirmed by Supreme Court decision in 1985.
It was taken illegally by the state of New York, but by that time, the state of New York had sold the land to private owners. Land companies had gotten involved, and it was in private landowners' hands now. It didn't belong to the state of New York.
I think that as a matter of federal law, the land claims case is over. What still remains to be done after all of the news hoopla, all of the publicity for well more than a year now, is to come to terms with the state of New York and get at what the recompense can possibly be in a timely and just fashion, not only for the Oneidas, but for the people who live here.
The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is in extending our commercial relations to have with them as little political connection as possible. 'Tis our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world.
When Washington published his farewell address in 1796, war was still raging between Great Britain and France. Washington believed it was best for the United States to remain above the fray. But maintaining this ideal in a hostile world had proved to be difficult.
The United States was pledged to help France. They'd actually signed a treaty saying that they would come to the aid of each other if either went to war with England. So the neutrality policy was in the face of this treaty, that Washington proclaimed neutrality, and he did it simply because America was not strong enough to get involved in the war. The only way that they could survive was to stay clear of the belligerents.
A treaty with the British, negotiated in 1795 by John Jay, angered the French and much of the American public, including some members of Washington's own cabinet.
Damn John Jay! Damn everyone who won't damn John Jay! Damn everyone who won't stay up all night damning John Jay!
The Jay Treaty of 1795, in the opinion of some people, leans a bit towards England. Well, the French therefore interpret us as having violated our commitment to them, And they actually go to war with us on the high seas, mostly in the Caribbean. So Adams inherits that situation from Washington, and it plagues his entire presidency.
During the next 3 years, the French seized over 300 American ships, with cargo valued around $20 million.
Adams sends a delegation to Paris to try to negotiate some kind of peace with France. 3 French delegates, who are called X, Y, and Z, demand the payment of a huge amount of money before they will even permit negotiations to proceed. The American delegation refuses to pay this ransom. Adams initially does not reveal this news to the American people because he knows once he does that, they are going to become extraordinarily belligerent and call for war, and he's trying to avoid war. Eventually, he does reveal that, and it is regarded as a slap in the face for the entire American nation.
In the wake of the XYZ affair, the United States became entangled in an undeclared war with France known as the Quasi-War. The Quasi-War took place mostly at sea, but there were immediate political consequences at home. Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, giving the government legal authority to silence its political enemies.
They were largely the work of the high Federalists in the Congress of the United States, who were calling for some attempts to suppress the Republican press.
They're vigorous enforcers, and it closes down every single Republican newspaper. They're very ruthless. They go after the prominent Republican editors. They go after a couple of congressmen.
The actual effect of the Alien and Sedition Acts was counterproductive from the point of view of the Federalists, because each of these people that were sent to jail became martyrs. And it effectively helped the election of Thomas Jefferson in 1800.
The Alien and Sedition Acts served as a rallying point for the new Republican Party. James Madison and Thomas Jefferson drafted the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions to challenge their constitutionality.
Whensoever the general government assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthorized, void, and of no force.
The Jefferson camp, Jefferson and Madison, their response to the Sedition Act is not to talk about freedom of the press or First Amendment privileges. Their response is to talk about secession. This is the doctrine that later would be the doctrine of John C. Calhoun and the doctrine of the Confederacy in South Carolina, so that the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions are not primarily statements about freedom of the press so much as the right of a state to nullify a federal law.
In 1800, Adams came to terms with France despite opposition from his own party.
In the end, Adams does what is the publicly right thing, which is the unpopular thing. If Adams had decided to go to war with France during his first term as president, he would have unquestionably been reelected in 1800 because there was huge support for a war with France. He refuses to do that and sends several peace delegations to Paris, which eventually produces the Treaty of Montfontaine, which ends the war. But that news doesn't come back in time to help him win the election of 1800.
Washington's policy of neutrality and Adams' pursuit of peace ultimately kept the U.S. out of a major European war, which may have saved the young republic from early destruction. It also established an important precedent in American foreign policy.
Washington's definition of American neutrality is also implicitly a definition of isolationism. It's an expansive form of isolationism, if you will, continentalism. And if you're a Native American, it doesn't look too isolationist at all. But it's a recognition in the 1790s by the leading statesmen that the future of America for the next 100 years lies within the North American continent and the occupation of that continent. And that until that has occurred, we ought not allow ourselves to be dragged into foreign entanglements.
Let me now warn you, in the most solemn manner, against the baneful effects of the spirit of party. The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge natural to party dissension, is itself a frightful despotism.
Despite George Washington's dire warning, two distinct political parties were discernible by the end of the 18th century. The Federalists emerged from a coalition that had fought for ratification of the Constitution in 1788. They were bound by a commitment to an energetic federal government. Washington was, by inclination, a Federalist, yet clear divisions over economic and foreign policy surfaced within his administration. Jefferson frequently opposed Federalist initiatives and eventually resigned as Secretary of State, complaining that he and Hamilton had been
pitted against each other every day in the cabinet like two fighting cocks.
James Madison joined Jefferson in leading the opposition Republican Party.
The Federalist notion of the relation between the government and the people was that the people voted, and then the people shut up, and they let their officials carry on all of the business of government. The Jeffersonian idea was that the government, they're servants of the people, and the citizen should be actively involved all the time.
By the election of 1800, the two parties were openly promoting different platforms. John Adams and Charles C. Pinckney ran for the Federalist Party. Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr ran as Republicans.
The Jeffersonian Party is the first party to recognize that it has to regard party behavior seriously and mobilize voters at the state level, and to regard the election as a kind of contest in which what we would now regard as modern political organizing is necessary. The Federalists don't understand that. The Federalists think that they just have to present their candidates and the people will naturally gravitate towards them. Federalists remain more deferential and more classical in their notions about what politics is supposed to be.
In the election of 1800, the Republicans better reflected the anti-elitist spirit of the times. When all of the votes were in, the two Republican candidates were locked in a tie for the presidency.
They ended up with a tie vote because party discipline was so excellent. The Republicans were so well organized that everybody voted for the two men. Now, the Constitution had arranged that the winner and the runner-up would become president and vice president, respectively. The Constitution also said if there wasn't a winner, that the vote was thrown into Congress. So it was thrown into the House. Then became the possibility of denying Jefferson the vote. And the Federalists, there were enough Federalist spoilers that would love to have done that. To Alexander Hamilton's credit, he really was the one who squashed that. He didn't like Jefferson, but he detested Burr. And so it didn't happen, and Jefferson was elected on the 37th or 8th or 9th ballot. It was clear then that the Constitution had not foreseen the development of parties, and so a constitutional amendment was proposed and passed very quickly, which set up separate elections for the president and vice president.
The big significance of the election of 1800, though, is that it's the first time when political power changes from one regime to another. 1800 is the first occasion when an opposition party, a new group, replaces the old group. By the creation of political parties, the United States effectively creates a way to discipline and structure and internalize conflict, and to create a situation in which different points of view can coexist without one side annihilating, massacring, executing the other side. The United States, in effect, internalizes a permanent dissent with the creation of political parties.
What's significant is what doesn't happen. Jefferson wins the election. The Federalists are truly horrified. They think that he is a very dangerous man, but they don't take any action. They don't rattle any swords. They don't talk about secession. They just go home and grumble. Power is transferred peacefully, and we can measure the real significance of that by the number of times in world history in which groups of people in power have not given up that power when they've been voted out of office. And they've overthrown the government. They've overthrown the Constitution. You cannot have democratic politics unless the people who are the participants in politics are willing to abide by the decisions at the ballot box.
Jefferson's inaugural address was conciliatory.
Every difference of opinion is not a difference in principle. We have called by different names brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists.
However, in a private letter of the same period, Jefferson wrote,
I shall, by the establishment of Republican principles, sink federalism into an abyss from which there shall be no resurrection of it.
Exactly 200 years after the first peaceful transfer of power, another presidential election challenged the stability of democracy in the United States. After one of the closest elections in history, Democrats contested the vote counts in the state of Florida. During a contentious month of court battles and partisan political conflict, the public waited for the outcome of the election to be decided. When the Supreme Court's decision went in favor of the Republicans, even the bitterest of Democrats accepted defeat. Once again, a peaceful transfer of power took place. In October of 1999, the city of Annapolis, Maryland was forced to cut down the last surviving Liberty Tree. Once standing in all of the 13 original colonies, these Liberty Trees were majestic symbols of patriotism during the Revolutionary War period. The Sons of Liberty gathered beneath them to rail against British tyranny and discuss the natural rights of free men. Although Liberty Trees no longer stand, the revolutionary ideals they symbolized took root early.
I think during the revolutionary period, two very striking things happened to the idea of freedom in American history. One is that freedom is universalized. In other words, this is a country whose Declaration of Independence declares liberty to be an inalienable right of all mankind. Instead of being, as in the colonial period, something associated with particular types of people, particular groups. So the United States sort of establishes itself as this embodiment of universal freedom, no longer the rights of Englishmen, the rights of mankind. The second thing that happens during the revolutionary period is that freedom is democratized. Many Americans stake a claim to freedom which they hadn't had in the colonial period. Poorer people, men who don't own property, demand the right to vote, political freedom. Some women demand greater rights than they'd had before. Many slaves stake a claim to freedom. They say, look, this is a country founded on liberty. Why are we enslaved?
You realize, of course, that more slaves were freed by the Revolutionary War than any other single thing until the Civil War. So that this was a period where America could have gone in a variety of directions. From the standpoint of African Americans, this is a period where if you didn't know history, if you didn't know what was coming, if you were looking forward, there's a possibility that you might believe that a racially integrated America, a racially egalitarian America was possible.
For women, they've grown up in, certainly free women, have grown up in a world in which they've been called upon to support the revolution. Unfree women, enslaved women, indentured women have been hearing the language of freedom and equality, and many of them are saying, well, what about us? Post-revolutionary people who have been growing up in a world in which assumptions about their relationship to the state has changed radically. So we're starting to see in 1800 women starting to make those claims a little more collectively.
In 1800, I think most Americans assumed that Native American people would have to become like European Americans, that there was no place really for Native Americans as Native Americans within the broader spectrum of American society. And consequently, a government initiated a, quote, civilization program, which was designed to turn Native American people into small yeoman farmers. It didn't work very well.
The American Revolution was fought for freedom and independence, but it was also fought for land. Geography played a critical role in the Revolution and in the development of the new country.
What the American Revolution produced were a series of contiguous colonies along the Atlantic seaboard that cooperated with one another. The 13 that rebelled were all together. They all touched one another. They stretched from Georgia to Maine was part of Massachusetts at that time, but along the what we now know as the seaboard of the United States. But the favorable terms of the treaty were not so much that that Atlantic coastal plain became the United States, but then an area which is probably twice as large as the settled area east of the Appalachian Mountains, west of the mountains, and the mountains themselves were also included, areas which were not settled. The existing colonies gaining independence, but they are also gaining a future as well as a present. And it's that future which becomes so important for the development of the United States